the sake of being able to debug this object. So I have two of the older projectiles that I modified briefly. If you remember, I kind of crunched this projectile down to be very simplified, so it was one collision, one result, right? And I'm going to use that for the demo. I've dragged this projectile into my prefabs folder to generate a prefab of it. And now we're going to target this object inside our library as the thing that we generate. Now, I'm going to go back to my player for a moment, and I want to dig down into the hierarchy of the player. And if you remember from last week, we have a player, we have a turret, and we have a barrel. I'm going to find at the end of the barrel, I'm going to create an empty game object that's going to act as the spawn location for any object that I generate. And so,
can we delete the projectile in the hierarchy?
we will eventually, yeah. Right now, I'm not really concerned about it. It's going to fly around, and it should function just like any other projectile that we shoot. So it's not doing us any harm. I'm going to go into my barrel, and now it doesn't necessarily have to be in the barrel. It could just be in the turret. It really doesn't matter. I'm going to choose to do this in my turret because its Z direction is pointing forward. It doesn't really matter in this case, but I like things kind of making logical directional sense. I'm going to right click on my turret, and I'm going to create an empty game object. This empty game object, I'm going to call this spawn. If I wanted to be more specific, I could call it projectile spawn. But because this is nested inside, the barrel, it should make sense to me that I'm generating a projectile. Now, I have the collider turned off on my barrel, which is an important thing, and I've also moved my spawn point out in front of my barrel. The reason I've done those two things is I don't want the projectile to overlap with a collider when I create it, because what would happen? It's going to register as a hit, so every time I shoot, I would shoot myself, right?
Wait, what did you do?
Where did you get the spawn? Where is the spawn? You made that?
It's an empty game object that I just made. So I made that by right-clicking on the turret. I created an empty game object, and I called it spawn.
What did you say?
So remember our previous conversation about when I said you should, turn off the collider for at least the barrel and likely the turret as well?
So could you do that again?
Yeah, so I right-clicked on, in my case, it's the turret on the player. So I right-clicked and chose to create an empty game object.
Yeah, I turned off all the colliders. What do I put this? What do I call it?
So I called mine spawn, and I put it right underneath the turret. So
In the turret in the hierarchy?
yes, and I positioned the spawn point so it's at the end of the barrel. Now I have my collider turned off as just a precaution so there's no overlap, because that would potentially register as a hit if it spawns and it overlaps the collider.
So it's not, yeah, I turned off the colliders already.
So I'm going to go back to player, and I'm going to choose to create another state machine that's going to function as my shoot command. Now,
Maybe a new one?
right now I have two state machines, and I've named them horribly. I have one called FSM and one called FSM2. So I'm going to rename my state machines. The first state machine is my movement. So I'm going to call it either player movement or just simply movement. So I'm just doing a little bit of cleanup. Movement. I'm going to go back to my second state machine, and I'm going to call this health. It's not player health, it's that general health, so I'm just calling it FSM health. I'm going to add another state machine.
Wait, how do you spell movement?
ENT.
ENT?
So I'm now going to my third state machine on the player, and I'm simply going to call this FSM shoot. If you want to come up with a better name for it, go for it, but we're just labeling things so they're making sense. This is a simple toggle. We want a state machine that goes from state 1 to state 2, or an idle state to a firing state. So I'm going to create two states, idle and fire, or shoot, whatever you want to call it. And on the idle state, I'm listening for input. So I'm going to go to the input category, and it's up to you to determine what kind of input. You could have multiple input, but for now, I'm going to listen for a mouse down. I'm going to get.
Since we're using our mouse to move it.
Yeah, I'm going to do a get mouse button down.
Oh, mouse button down.
It's the left button that we're listening for. I'm going to create a new next event. Pass that over to the fire state. And just like we've done with previous state machines, we could add a finish state and have it pass back through, but we have an infinite fire solution. We need a rate of fire to maintain a rate of fire, and so the easiest thing to do is going to be add a wait command on our fire and just have a really simple short wait. And this wait time is going to be whatever our rate of fire is. I'm going to choose 0.2. Later we could turn this into a variable that could potentially change with a power up. I'm going to create a new event that I'm going to use pretty regularly, which is a reset event. And so here's the logic flow that I have set up. It's an idle state waiting for mouse down. We pass it over to the fire state where it just waits for a certain time. And again, this is our rate of fire, the wait state. So if we increase that wait, it slows down our rate of fire. So it.
Could you do the whole thing over again?
In a minute, I want to satisfy. I want to make it shoot first. But for now, I'm going to test this. So all it is a toggle. Okay, to where click the mouse, it passes it to fire. Okay. I'm going to toggle the play button. I will review that one more time. So I'm going to remove the state machine. I'll do it very quickly, which is I'm going to add a state machine. I'm going to name it FSM shoot. On state 1, I'm going to listen for get mouse down, get mouse button down. I'm going to create a new next event. I'm going to pass that over to the new state, which is going to be the fire state. And I'm going to have a simple wait state, which is going to be our rate of fire. I'm going to do 0.2 for now. I'm going to create a new event. I could just use the next event as a simple reset, but I'm just going to wire it this way. So this is testable. I'm going to test it with a little toggle button here. And you can see that, I'm shooting. We're not shooting anything yet, but the toggle is working. And so the final thing that I'm going to do is on the fire state, this is where we're going to create a game object. So I'm going to type in create. We're going to create object. The object that we're going to create, this game object field, this is where we drag our projectile from our prefabs in. So we want to create based on the prefab.
In the prefab folder, not
Yep.
in the hierarchy.
Yep. And the spawn point, what's the spawn that we want to create it at?
The spawn object.
Yeah, the spawn object that's in a turret. So I'm going to drag my spawn object in. I'm not worried about at position, rotation, or store object. Maybe later I'll store the object, which just means I'll know individually which projectile we shoot so we can do some fancy stuff with it. But if that's all wired properly and all the forces are working the way that they should.
And mine gone. And mine gone.
Yep, so now we can start, pointing around and shooting.
And myself is gone. I just shot it and I killed myself somehow.
Yeah, so your colliders are probably overlapping somehow.
What do you mean my collider? I turned off all the full colliders.
Okay, we'll troubleshoot, look at what you're doing, see where you're producing content, see if the content is being generated. Make sure that you're creating your projectile
I mean, it was.
at the spawn.
It
So
just kills me, though.
yeah, that means your health system's working.
So, I mean, I know it was working because I did test the file before.
Yeah,
So it's technically is working. I don't know. I didn't.
you just got to get in there and figure out. If it's destroying you, it's hitting you.
Yeah, but I
Right?
don't get how.
So maybe it's flying in the wrong direction and flying into you. So the best test is to move the spawn point way outside the player and see what the projectile is doing. If you can't see the projectile, you can't troubleshoot it.